Post-2020 R-Vees are losing value fast, and the real reason was buried on purpose. This isn't a market dip, it's a fallout. Production shortcuts approved during the surge are now being exposed through recalls and repair delays. The scary part is the next wave could widen the gap between who exits cleanly and who gets stuck. Here's what changed, and why it matters now. Demand broke the guardrails. After 2020, the RV industry didn't just grow, it panicked. Order books exploded faster than factories could react, and instead of slowing sales or limiting output, manufacturers made a quiet decision: ship first, justify later. Production caps vanished, output quotas replaced build discipline, internal benchmarks shifted from completion accuracy to daily unit counts. And once that happens, quality stops being a requirement and becomes a gamble. That change matters because it exposes the first layer of the scam. Public messaging kept promising craftsmanship, heritage, and built-to-last reliability, while internal planning treated speed as survival. When leadership made backlog reduction the top priority, every safeguard downstream became negotiable. Materials were approved faster, sometimes with less testing. Timelines shrank until crews were rushing steps that used to be slow for a reason. Oversight windows closed. Final checks became good enough as long as units kept moving. None of that showed up in brochures or dealer walkthroughs. And here's the key point: this wasn't one brand or one plant. It was a system-wide shift in incentives. When the only number that matters is how many units leave the line today, the whole culture changes. The story sold externally was stability and reliability. The story lived internally was urgency and volume. That contradiction fueled everything that followed, because buyers were led to believe the product was improving, while the process behind it was being stripped down. High demand created cover. When demand stays elevated, flaws hide behind waitlists, hype, and the excitement of finally getting your unit. The system exploited that delay. By the time pressure eased, thousands of rigs had already left facilities built under a different rulebook. And that rulebook didn't evolve, it got replaced. Once speed became law, the easiest lever to pull wasn't design, it was labor, training, and inspection authority. Labor was the first cost cut. With output targets rising, factories needed hands immediately. Experience was no longer the filter. Availability was. Training programs collapsed from structured instruction into shadowing whoever stood nearby. Skill concentration disappeared. Tasks fragmented. Accountability thinned. This wasn't framed as neglect. It was framed as efficiency. Cross-coverage replaced mastery. New hires cycled through stations before learning consequences. Turnover surged as stress rose and knowledge walked out daily. Management tracked numbers, not craftsmanship. The scam here was subtle. Marketing still spoke of heritage and build quality, but production relied on constant churn. When skilled labor becomes optional, precision becomes accidental. Even capable workers lost authority to slow lines. Pausing output triggered review. Missing targets triggered consequence. The message was clear without being spoken: move forward. Fix later. That logic removed resistance inside the system. Problems stopped being corrected and started being absorbed. Once absorption becomes policy, escalation dies. That silence mattered because the next safeguard depended on someone speaking up. When nobody could afford to stop the line, nothing stopped moving forward. Oversight quietly transformed to match the new pace. If this breakdown is helping you see what really changed after 2020, hit like so others find it, subscribe for the next expose, and share your experience in the comments to keep the facts visible. And pressure on inspection became paperwork. Inspection once functioned as friction. After 2020, it became confirmation. Physical verification gave way to checklist compliance. Part identifiers repeated across revisions to simplify approval. Sign-offs happened digitally, sometimes after units advanced. This created the illusion of control without the reality. On paper, everything passed. In practice, verification faded. When inspections stop slowing production, leadership assumes they are working. That assumption masked the scam. Safety language remained intact, while enforcement disappeared. Variance became acceptable. Acceptable became routine. Routine became invisible. No alarms triggered because the system wasn't designed to flag normalization. It only flagged deviation. Over time, inspection lost authority. It recorded movement rather than evaluated outcome. That mattered because inspection exists to interrupt momentum. When it stops interrupting, momentum dominates. This explains how large-scale exposure formed without immediate detection. Nothing screamed failure. Everything whispered compliance. The structure rewarded silence. Only one thing could break that silence: repetition. When the same approval appeared too often, someone finally noticed. One shared component tied approvals together and pulled the curtain back. That discovery triggered a shock no spreadsheet could soften. The first recall shock. At first, it looked like routine paperwork. Then, everything started dropping prices, approvals, confidence, specific model years, mandatory instructions, immediate restrictions. Financial systems reacted before emotions did. Insurance classifications shifted. Financing terms tightened. Listings stalled. Appraisals dropped overnight. Value loss arrived before explanation. That sequence mattered because it revealed how deep the problem ran. Recalls are meant to isolate issues. This one connected them. Documentation showed overlap, where separation should exist. Similar approvals, identical language, shared timelines. That pattern exposed the scam's core. This wasn't a mistake, it was a method. The recall forced scrutiny backward, not forward. Investigators followed paperwork trails and found consistency where variation should have lived. Each discovery widened scope. What was assumed contained proved systemic. The market recalculated instantly. Risk models adjusted. Confidence evaporated. The shock wasn't about a single fix, it was about realization. If this passed unnoticed, what else did too? That question changed behavior everywhere. The recall didn't end the story, it exposed it, designing around responsibility. Cost pressure did not just reshape schedules, it reshaped paperwork. To protect output, manufacturers leaned on classification tricks that shifted responsibility away from the factory floor. Components were labeled optional, even when designs depended on them. Systems were tagged dealer installed, despite appearing in factory layouts. On paper, this separated the manufacturer from downstream consequences. In practice, it erased accountability before anything shipped. Internal documents treated these labels as risk buffers, not descriptions. If a component was optional, it carried lighter review. If it was dealer installed, the factory avoided final sign-off. That logic spread quietly. Engineers learned which words moved projects forward. Over time, responsibility fragmented. No single group owned the whole system. When questions surfaced, each department pointed elsewhere using the same paperwork. This mattered because safety design relies on clear ownership. When ownership dissolves, gaps appear. Convenience features expanded under this logic because they promised margins without long testing cycles. Mounts, frames, and attachments grew more complex without growing oversight. Everything looked compliant, nothing looked connected. That disconnect set the stage for a failure no checklist could catch. One feature, promoted as harmless convenience, would later block escape. That paper shield failed under real movement. Escape time that didn't exist. Emergency escape systems are tested against time, not comfort. Under controlled conditions, exits must open quickly, consistently, and without force. Testing after 2020 revealed a problem. Added hardware, narrowed clearances, and altered swing paths. Windows jammed against frames. Latches flexed under heat. Exits that opened freely when cold resisted movement once materials expanded. Measured trials showed evacuation times exceeding federal limits by wide margins. Seconds mattered because smoke density increases rapidly in enclosed cabins. When exits slow, risk compounds. The failure was mechanical, not behavioral. Designs assumed static geometry, but travel introduces vibration and heat. Hinges shifted, mounts crept, clearances vanished. Blocked exits were not obvious during assembly because tolerances stacked gradually. Each added bracket or trim piece reduced margin slightly. Individually acceptable changes combined into obstruction. Test footage documented repeated delays across multiple layouts. These were not edge cases. They were predictable outcomes of layered additions. Once measured, the risk became quantifiable. It was no longer hypothetical. Time to exit exceeded safe thresholds in scenarios that should have passed easily. That data forced a conclusion. Escape time did not exist as designed. And once escape fails, the next calculation becomes unavoidable. Heat exposure made risk measurable. Fire was the math. Fire behavior follows physics, not intent. When material thickness drops and vibration rises, failure accelerates. Cost reductions replaced heavier brackets with thinner stamped supports. Under constant road motion, microfractures formed at stress points. These cracks were invisible initially, but expanded with each cycle. Heat from exhaust systems compounded the problem, softening metal and accelerating deformation. Once supports weakened, adjacent lines sagged closer to heat sources. Ignition did not require unusual conditions. Normal operation was enough. Investigators traced repeated events to the same mechanical sequence. The math was consistent. Thinner material saved weight and money upfront, but multiplied thermal exposure later. Vibration frequency matched natural resonance, amplifying stress. That resonance turned minor imperfections into breaks. Documentation showed unchanged specifications across production runs, meaning the flaw persisted. Because the issue was rooted in physics, not assembly error, repetition was inevitable. No amount of careful driving cooling, altered expansion rates, or vibration patterns. The environment guaranteed recurrence. This explains why incidents clustered around similar mileage and use profiles. The cause was embedded. As long as the geometry and materials stayed the same, outcomes repeated. That realization carried a final shock. The same configuration still appeared in current builds. Structural fatigue pushed losses outward. Structural failure shifted the bill. Structural failures did not end at detection. They transferred cost. Welded tank supports, shortened during redesigns, left gaps that vibration exploited. Over time, seams fatigued and separated. When supports failed, entire systems shifted, tearing lines and damaging mounts. Repairs were not cosmetic. They required reinforcement, reinstallation, and testing. Pricing reflected that complexity. Shops quoted thousands for labor and parts because access was limited and risk high. Coverage disputes followed immediately. Documentation showed some assemblies classified as external, shifting responsibility away from core warranties. That classification mattered because it determined who paid. When claims stalled, storage and downtime costs accumulated. Each week off the road added expense without reducing loan obligations. Depreciation accelerated because repaired units carried visible history. Even after fixes, valuation models adjusted downward due to prior structural intervention. The loss was not only repair cost, it was liquidity. Selling became harder. Trading became expensive. Timing mattered because unresolved support failures froze options. This stage revealed the final consequence of shortcuts. Mechanical failure triggered financial lock-in. Once money is trapped, choices narrow quickly. That narrowing, more than any broken weld, defined the damage. The largest loss was control, not hardware failure anymore. Today alone now clearly shown. Help that never arrived. When problems surfaced, the first instinct was to seek support through warranty channels. That process stalled quickly. Claims entered queues with no firm timelines. Approvals required repeated documentation. Each request reset the clock. While paperwork moved slowly, costs did not pause. Repairs needed to prevent further damage were paid out of pocket to keep units usable. That spending changed coverage status. Once unauthorized work occurred, protection weakened. Some claims were reduced, others were denied entirely. Coverage erosion happened quietly, line by line. Inside policy language, few people read closely. Time magnified the damage. Waiting meant storage fees, loan payments, and insurance premiums continued without relief. Each delay forced a decision: wait longer or pay more now. Either option reduced flexibility. The system favored endurance, not resolution. Communication gaps made it worse. Calls went unanswered. Emails returned form responses. Escalation paths led nowhere. The financial burden shifted downward, absorbing savings intended for travel or resale. What mattered most was not frustration, but liquidity. Cash left quickly. Reimbursement rarely arrived. By the time clarity emerged, options narrowed. The structure did not collapse suddenly. It drained steadily. And as those drains multiplied, pressure moved outward, reaching places that could not absorb it quietly anymore. That pressure soon landed on inventory itself. Inventory became a liability. Inventory is rarely free. Each unsold R-V sits under a financing clock that charges daily. Floor plan lending operates on short cycles, rolling every few weeks. When units cannot move, interest compounds. After stop sale, notices expanded. Lots filled with product that could not legally transact. The clock kept running. Storage, insurance, and interest stacked together. Cash flow tightened fast. To relieve pressure, prices moved. Discounts appeared not as promotions, but as survival tactics. Reductions deepened week by week. What started as small cuts became large drops, meant to move anything that could still transact. The problem compounded because visible discounts reset expectations everywhere. Listings adjusted. Appraisals followed. Each forced sale created a new reference point lower than the last. That math worked against recovery. Holding inventory became riskier than releasing it at a loss. Even compliant units were affected by association. Once buyers saw numbers fall, hesitation increased. Movement slowed further. The system fed itself. Discounting intended to relieve pressure amplified it instead. Inventory transformed from asset to liability. As pricing slipped, balance sheets weakened. That weakness spread outward, beyond individual lots, into the broader market where value depends on confidence. Confidence collapsed when pricing signals reached auctions. Depreciation, math took over, auction lanes do not lie. When units entered wholesale channels, pricing reset quickly. Bids came in lower than expected, reflecting risk rather than condition. Data showed steep drops over short periods. Models that once held steady lost value in months. Trade-ins were refused outright or accepted at sharp reductions. Lenders responded to those signals. Loan terms tightened approval. Thresholds rose. Older identification numbers faced scrutiny. Some financing options disappeared entirely. The math was straightforward. Falling collateral values increase risk exposure. Institutions protect themselves first. That protection rippled outward. Private sellers discovered offers vanished. Dealers adjusted buy numbers downward to avoid future exposure. Even well-maintained units suffered because market pricing is collective, not individual. Once depreciation accelerates, it rarely reverses quickly. Charts confirmed the trend. Year-over-year comparisons showed unprecedented declines, concentrated in post-2020 builds. That concentration mattered because it pointed to systemic causes, not market mood. Depreciation math replaced optimism. Decisions were driven by spreadsheets, not desire. With values sliding, repair approvals mattered more. Fixes could stabilize numbers if completed quickly, but speed required resources that were no longer available. The inability to fix anything became the next choke point. Parts became the bottleneck. Approved repairs mean little without components. Supply chains strained under volume shifts and redesigns. Certain parts entered extended back order status with no firm delivery dates. Service centers rationed inventory, prioritizing safety-critical work while deferring everything else. Wait times stretched from weeks into months. During that time, costs continued accumulating. Storage fees mounted, insurance covered less. Loan payments did not pause. Daily ownership expenses added up quietly, draining resources. Some units sat unusable, neither repairable nor sellable. That limbo mattered because time itself became expensive. Each delayed week reduced remaining value and increased sunk cost. Workarounds failed because substitutions required approvals that stalled equally. The system slowed everywhere at once. Movement stopped. Financial damage spread through inertia rather than action. This bottleneck exposed the final weakness of the structure. Volume had outpaced support capacity. Once support failed, everything downstream froze immediately. Regulators track timelines between identification and resolution closely because delay signals risk. As delays lengthened, oversight intensified across agencies. Questions followed quickly. Reporting requirements expanded. Documentation requests multiplied. What began as a production issue shifted into a compliance problem. That transition mattered because compliance failures trigger enforcement, not discussion. Attention moved upward, beyond markets and inventory, toward authority with power to act. That attention did not remain internal. It reached outside the industry, into public records, oversight bodies, and enforcement channels. Once scrutiny crosses that boundary, control no longer belongs to manufacturers. It belongs to regulators. Exposure reaches Washington. Pressure that could not be absorbed elsewhere eventually surfaced publicly. Congressional hearings formed after audit records showed repeated gaps between reported compliance and documented outcomes. Testimony focused on oversight failures rather than individual incidents. Lawmakers questioned how internal reviews missed patterns spanning multiple years. Audit trails revealed missed follow-ups, deferred verification, and fragmented reporting structures. Investors reacted quickly once transcripts circulated. Stock prices dipped as risk models recalculated long-term exposure. That reaction mattered because markets often respond before policy changes arrive. Public accountability followed a similar arc. Media coverage shifted tone from isolated mishaps to systemic oversight failure. Language hardened, questions sharpened. The issue stopped being technical and became reputational. That shift increased pressure across agencies responsible for safety oversight. Documentation once buried in appendices entered public record. Confidence eroded further as timelines showed repeated tolerance rather than correction. The hearings did not produce answers immediately, but they changed posture. Silence became costly. Delay became visible. Once attention reached this level, continuation without response was no longer viable. The system faced a choice between adaptation and enforcement. History shows which path follows scrutiny of this scale. That scrutiny unlocked enforcement power. Stop-ship authority changes everything. Enforcement arrived through expanded authority. Regulators gained power to halt production immediately when unresolved safety risks appeared. Stop ship orders no longer required prolonged negotiation. The change mattered because time favors volume, not caution. Daily penalties attached to non-compliance introduced direct financial consequences, fines accumulated per unit, not per incident, reshaping risk calculations overnight. Audit requirements tightened alongside enforcement. Documentation now required real-time verification rather than retrospective reporting. Failure to produce records triggered escalation automatically. This altered corporate behavior without touching design details. Executives responded to incentives. When penalties outweighed delays, behavior shifted. Production freezes disrupted schedules, creating pressure up the supply chain. Compliance teams gained leverage internally. Risk managers moved from advisory roles to gatekeepers. The math became simple. Continuing without clearance cost more than stopping. That equation reversed years of practice. The market adjusted quickly. Announcements referenced compliance milestones rather than launch dates. The threat was not theoretical. Enforcement actions were public, measurable, and costly. Once exercised, authority rarely retracts. The industry understood the message clearly. Adaptation was no longer optional. It was required to survive under the new rule set. Survival demanded traceability. Manufacturing gets tracked. Traceability changed production culture. Automated welding systems replaced manual variability with measurable consistency. Sensors recorded torque, heat, and alignment at each joint. Data streamed into centralized logs accessible during audits. Digital records replaced trust-based verification. Every step left a timestamp. That transparency altered cost calculations. Automation raised per unit expense, but reduced downstream exposure dramatically. Internal models compared recall risk against equipment investment. The balance shifted in favor of prevention. Digital audit trails closed gaps that paperwork once hid. Deviations triggered alerts rather than memos. Supervisors could intervene immediately instead of reviewing reports later. This mattered because prevention operates in real time. The cost versus risk equation became visible to leadership. Spending increased upfront, but volatility decreased. Markets prefer predictability. Insurers adjusted premiums accordingly. Certification cycles shortened once consistency proved reliable. Oversight became continuous rather than episodic. The structure no longer relied on memory or goodwill. It relied on recorded fact. That evolution marked a real change. However, systems only protect when monitored. Records mean nothing if ignored. Proof exists only when someone checks it. Checking shifted responsibility outward. That shift matters because accountability now travels beyond institutions into individual decisions and timing. When attention fades, risks quietly return, prices drift, confidence erodes, and avoidable losses reappear. Across high-value markets under tightening credit conditions today, again everywhere, the only protection left. Protection now depends on verification. Identification numbers link directly to recall databases that update continuously. Searching those records reveals unresolved actions and compliance status. Inspection priorities matter because visible areas rarely show underlying risk. Structural supports, mounting points, and exit pathways reveal more than finishes. Timing discipline matters as well. Waiting allows enforcement actions to surface and pricing to adjust. Rushing transfers risk to the buyer side of the transaction. Documentation protects leverage. Written confirmations matter more than verbal assurances. Records preserve options if conditions change. Awareness saves money because it preserves choice. When information arrives late, options disappear. The landscape has shifted. Oversight tightened. Tracking improved. But protection does not arrive automatically. It must be exercised deliberately. The final safeguard is attention. Attention turns information into advantage. Advantage reduces exposure. Exposure determines outcome. This is not about fear. It is about math. Verified status reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty stabilizes value. Stability protects liquidity. Liquidity protects freedom. The system now rewards patience and diligence over enthusiasm. Those who verify before committing retain control. Control determines whether losses compound or stop. In this environment, awareness is not optional. It is the only protection left. It saves money when timing shifts, prices fall, and rules change without warning. Careful decisions today prevent regret tomorrow across markets and tightening credit conditions. The truth is finally visible. What happened after 2020 wasn't bad luck. It was an industry choosing speed over durability, then burying the fallout. Now you know where the risk lives. how value disappears, and why patience and verification protect your money. If you have questions about your brand, model, or recall status, drop them in the comments so I can cover them and help others too. Hit like to push this to more owners, and subscribe so you don't miss the next update as the market resets again.